Hello, I'm Jeremy Benstein. I'm actually the editor of 929 English, the website, and I'm happy to be part of this 24 and 24 project. I am be speaking today about the book of Ruth, and in particular, it is its connection and layers of meaning that we can derive in the story of Ruth from several antecedent stories, from two other stories previous to it in the Bible. And while I don't want to make this sound like a podcast, I feel like I should have a sort of obscenity warning, or at least to say that given the stories that we'll be discussing, which you can see a little bit from the illustrations here on my opening slide, we will be acknowledging the fact of sex and sexual relations in various forms. Okay, let us begin. Okay. So the first story that I want to talk about, let me put myself in the right place on the screen here. First story that I want to talk about is actually, because we're talking about the book of Ruth, and Ruth is a Moabite, right, from the nation of Moab. She is explicitly a descendant of the original person named Moab, and it behooves us to talk about who that person was. And not only because there's a genealogical relationship, but because the actual story is connected, the structure of the story. And if I didn't mention this already, this whole presentation is based on an analysis that I learned from the literary scholar Harold Fish in an article of his, where he uses the structuralist principles originated first by Claude Lévi-Strauss in the field of anthropology, but were of course also very influential in literary criticism and in other cultural studies. So here, I'm just going to give you two brief descriptions of these two antecedent stories, and then we will dive into a comparison of all three stories. So let me say already also at the outset that I will not be presenting the plot and narrative of Ruth in any detail, in sort of ironically or paradoxically, because this is about Ruth, but I feel more of the need to go into the details of the previous stories. And then as we do the comparison, I will be presenting part of the story of Ruth. But if you want to, if you don't feel that you're familiar with Ruth, you might want to pause now and just go over that. It's 4 short chapters, and it's a beautiful story. In fact, in my opinion, it's one of the literary gems, not only of the Bible. It's a perfect micronovella, but I think of all of world literature in terms of its conciseness and everything. And as we'll see, also the echoes and the layers that it has as part of the greater biblical literary context. Okay, so the first story, we shall begin. This is from Genesis chapter 19, and it is the story of Lot and his daughters. If you remember, Lot was living in Sodom, and when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, he was able to get out with his wife and 2 daughters, and then his wife looked back, turned into a pillar of salt, as it were, but he escaped with his 2 daughters. Okay, so it begins here. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, including the death of his wife and the 2 sons-in-law, Lot and his 2 now widowed daughters flee to a cave. Okay, now remember, they just saw their entire city wiped off the face of the planet with fire and brimstone, and it was must have been quite an experience, quite a traumatic experience, and they apparently felt like maybe the entire civilized world had been destroyed. And so one daughter said, this is a quote, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to consort with us." In other words, to become our new husbands and to get us pregnant and to continue the human race, right? "So come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father." So they got him drunk, and the older one first lay with him, with Lot, and then the next night they did the same thing, got him drunk again, and the younger one lay with him, and both times he did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Okay, so Lot was completely oblivious to this entire experience. They, of course, both became pregnant, and the older one bore a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites, and the son of the younger, called Ben-Ami, is the father of the Ammonites. Okay, that's the entire story. It's 8 verses, and from that we get the origin story of the Moabites, and again, that will be the people to whom Ruth belongs. But we'll soon see there are much deeper and more significant connections with the story than just the genealogical origin. Okay, the second story I'd like to talk about is a few chapters later in Genesis chapter 38. This time it's a longer story. I'll also try to kind of summarize it as briefly as possible. This is the story of Judah, Yehudah, who is the son, of course, of Jacob, fourth son, and of Leah by Jacob. And this is the story of his family. So he leaves. This is actually told right after the incident of Joseph going to find his brothers, and his brothers strip him of his coat, throw him in a pit, and eventually sell him. Okay, so it's right after that. And so this is actually a break in the story where the story will next pick up with Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. But now we have this little story sort of all set off on itself. And it talks about Judah marries this woman named Shua, and they have three sons, Er and Onan and Shelach. Okay, so Er, the oldest son, marries a woman named Tamar. Okay, now Er dies. We don't know exactly why, but it says that God punishes Er with death. And then Judah tells the middle son, right, Er's younger brother, Onan, to marry Tamar, to marry his brother's widow instead of Er, who had died, and which is called a levirate marriage, from levir in Latin, which means brother-in-law, and give her a son. Okay, the idea is to continue the line, or essentially continue the dead husband's line. Now Onan knows that that son that would be born to Tamar, that he would essentially be the biological father, it really wouldn't be considered his. It would actually be continuing Er's line. And so he decides not to impregnate her, as it says in the verse, wastes his seed. And if you've ever heard of the English phrase, the English term onanism, well, it comes from Onan. Okay, so he too is then punished with death, although this time we sort of know what the reason is, that this was seen as a very unrighteous act, ungenerous act towards his brother and essentially towards his sister-in-law, that he would not agree to help her have a child. So then Judah, after two of his sons having died, apparently, or seemingly at the hands of Tamar, he sends Tamar back to her father, which is near a place called Timnah. And essentially, he says it's to wait till Shelach grows up. Apparently, he's still pretty young. But it seems that perhaps Judah is afraid that he too might die. Okay. Then a little while later, Judah goes to this place, Timnah, to the sheep shearing, right? This is sort of the seasonal festival of the shearing of the sheep. And Tamar hears that he's coming, and of course she knows that Shelach had not yet been given to her in marriage, and she disguises herself as a prostitute and waits for Judah at a place called Petach Einaim, the entrance to a place called Einaim, or more literally, the entrance to the eyes, okay? And that plays a role, of course, we're talking about disguises and deceptions. Okay, now Judah does not recognize her, of course, she's disguised, and he thinks she's a prostitute, so he asks to avail himself of her services, and he offers to pay her with a sheep. He doesn't have the sheep with him, so she demands that he leave these objects of personal recognition, his seal, his cord, and his staff, until the sheep can be sent. Okay, he does all this, and then, of course, she becomes pregnant. And then Tamar puts off her prostitute's garb and returns to her life as a widow. Now, then Judah does try to send the kid in payment, but nobody can find this ostensible prostitute. Okay, now 3 months later, Judah is told that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, is pregnant. Okay, which of course means that she was not faithful. She's not supposed to be married or connected to anybody. So he actually says, well, that's, a grave sin. He calls for her to be taken out and burned. Tamar then says that she is pregnant by the man who owns the seal and the cord and the staff. And Judah recognized them, and he said, she is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelach. And Judah is indeed a figure of in this case, remorse, atonement, certainly acknowledgement and confession, very much in a similar way as we will see him later on with Joseph at the end of the Joseph and his brother story. Okay, so then Tamar, who had been pregnant, actually gives birth now to twin boys named Peretz and Zerach. Okay, now why is this connected to the Ruth story? Because it very explicitly says at the end of chapter 4, the end of the book of Ruth, that Boaz is a descendant of Peretz. Okay, Peretz, the son of Tamar, they even mention it explicitly, Tamar and Judah. And so this is the backstory of Boaz, who becomes Ruth's husband. So we have the backstory of Ruth, which involves this kind of deception and impregnation. And we have the backstory of Boaz, which involves a very similar thing. So now we're going to look at the three stories together and analyze them according to certain structural components of the story, okay? And I don't know if you're like me, but I happen to love tables and matrices. So we will do this in table form to try to keep things straight. There'll be two tables that you'll see, and I'll fill them in and discuss them gradually. Each table has three rows. The first one is, we're looking at components of the story of Lot and his daughters, Genesis chapter 19, the first story that I summarized. The second line will be Judah and Tamar, Genesis 38, the second story. And the third line will be, in fact, the book that we're attempting to try to present today, which is the book of Ruth, or the story of Ruth and Boaz, okay, which is 4 full chapters, okay? So we already see that there's a certain progression, that we go from a very short and intense vignette to a longer, sort of more developed chapter with a narrative, a beginning, middle, and an end. And then Ruth and Boaz, of course, is an entire, like I said, a micronovella of 4 full chapters. Okay, now those are the rows. The columns, at least in this table, I don't think I'll just explain the headings, but you'll see what they refer to as I go on. So for instance, first, and you'll see that we can use this table both to look at what is similar. In other words, what's the internal structure, kind of the scaffolding on which the story is told. And of course, there are similarities and there are differences. Clearly, they're very different stories. But by comparing the similarities, we will then highlight the differences and then see how each story is essentially a progression from the other. And in fact, the third story, Ruth and Boaz, is almost a kind of transcendental synthesis, if I can say as much. Okay, let's see that in some of these more simple narrative points. So in each story, there's a disaster which leaves women husbandless and therefore unable to fulfill the role of motherhood, to perpetuate the family or the generation, etc. So the first story, Sodom, the entire city is destroyed, and Lot has 2 daughters, and they have 2 dead husbands. Okay, now in the second story, Judah and Tamar, there are also 2 dead husbands, right? There's and there's Onan, but this time it's only one woman, one widow who is left husbandless and therefore childless. And in the third story, Ruth and Boaz, if you remember the beginning of the story of Ruth, it's the story of Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and she goes off down to Moab, and her sons marry. One marries Ruth, and the other marries a woman named Orpah. And then the father Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons die. And so then it's 2 women in this case, but not, in fact, both are widows, but it's actually Naomi who's the mother-in-law of Ruth, and Ruth the daughter-in-law, and Orpah is also there as a second widow, third widow in essence, but like a second parallel widow to Ruth, but she ends up not joining the story. She ends up turning back and going to Moab, whereas the story then continues when they return to Bethlehem. So it's 2 women, but one woman, essentially, just like Tamar, was Ruth, and there are 2 dead husbands of Ruth and Orpah. Okay, and it's interesting also to note, I won't go into too much in the Hebrew, but it's interesting to note that the actual disastrous nature or catastrophic component of the story is right there in the names of the dead husbands, right? And Onan, Judah's sons, the brothers. is connected, at least in rabbinic midrash, with Ariri, which means childless, and Onan, On, is a synonym for mourning, and the 2 sons of Naomi and Elimelech are Machlon and Kilion, both of which also have kind of disastrous connections. Machlon, machala, which means sickness or disease, and Kilion from Chilia, which means destruction or erasure. I mean, something getting rid of it. Okay, so we have those very symbolic names. That is the first thing we're going to compare. Now, in each one, of course, there is a figure of a redeemer, the one who actually comes through, the one who becomes the father. So in the first story, it's Lot, who's the father of the two women. In the second story, it's Judah, who's actually the father-in-law of Tamar, the one woman, but he's actually the second in line as a redeemer, as it were, after Onan, right? There was Er, who was the original husband, Onan, who was the first redeemer who refused essentially to fulfill that role, and then Judah is then commandeered or enlisted to the task. And then in the Ruth story, we have Boaz, who is actually not a father, not a father-in-law, but he is actually the cousin of the mother-in-law. And this progression is also significant, and we'll talk about it in a second. But he, like Judah, is also the second Levir, the second redeemer in line, because when he goes to the city gates in chapter 4 to do the public pronouncement of actually acquiring a Ruth and essentially fulfilling his duty towards Naomi and her family. So there is someone first in line before him, and that person he's called Ploni Almoni, translated in the JPS as so-and-so, because it is indeed like a John Doe sort of name. But Ploni refuses to fulfill his task, not exactly with the same technique as Onan, but it does make Boaz into the actual redeemer, as it were, to come in to marry Ruth. Okay, so that's the redeemer. Now, going back to the plot, essentially, there's a turning point or a sort of festival or a particular act that becomes the opportunity for the woman to take the initiative in each story. So in the first story, of course, they need to get their father drunk. So that night, these are all quotes, right? That night, they made their father drink wine, and then they can do the deed, as it were. In the second story, it's a little bit less obvious, no drink involved. But Judah went up to Timnah and to the sheep shearers, and that's also a festival time. And so he was on his way in that frame of mind when he runs into Tamar, the apparent prostitute. And then in the third story, Boaz actually is part of the harvest festival, sort of like sheep shearing event. There's a harvest festival, and they're there in the threshing floor, and he ate and drank and in a cheerful mood, right? Nobody got him drunk, but he went to lie down in the goren, in the threshing floor, and went to sleep. Okay, so we see the parallels there and also the progression. Now here, if you'll indulge my predilection for Hebrew wordplay, here's something that wasn't in Harold Fish's article, but it sort of jumped out at me, right? There's a certain kind of deception in each of the stories, and deception in Hebrew is orma, right? If you know the story of the Garden of Eden, the snake was considered erom, which is to say cunning or deceitful, also naked. But there is nakedness involved in this story as well. But here I'm just referring to the act of deception and where it took place, okay? So if you take those 4 letters, 5 letters actually, 2 Hays, and an Ayin, Resh, and a Mem, so that's the Orma of the deception. The first story took place in Hame'ara, okay? The cave. And we'll also talk about the significance of a cave and what that signifies in terms of the story. The second one took place where there are sheep, which is a meadow or a mir'eh, where they go to graze. That one's a little bit my invention. The word mir'eh is not used, whereas me'ara is used in the first story. And in the third story, in Ruth, the word arima is actually used, a pile of grain, right? The grain pile at the threshing floor. That's where Boaz laid himself down. So we have exactly the same letters in 4 different permutations. I just thought that was a little bit too cool to leave unmentioned. Okay, last but not least, I'm now going to move myself to the corner here. You can look at me over there. So here let's just be explicit now about the kinship connection and essentially the nature of the female initiative, right? If I didn't emphasize it enough, each of these stories is a story where the woman or women are totally the drivers of the plot and the ones who make the story happen, not only the story, but the history happen. While not unique to the Tanakh, it's very significant that these are 3 stories that are so intimately connected with one another. Okay, so the first story is, of course, daughter-father relationship, and it is an incestuous rape with intoxication. Can't get more sort of raw and visceral than that. The second story is the daughter-in-law and the father-in-law. Okay, so already seeing like once removed, it's not the same kind of direct incest. And it's not date rape with alcohol, but it's a seduction, as it were, and through the use of a disguise, right, a physical disguise. Now then we get even more further removed in the Ruth and Boaz story, because it's not the daughter-in-law, it's actually the cousin of the daughter-in-law, who's Boaz to Ruth. There's no explicit seduction, as it were, although there is that scene that just has that little, I would say, a frisson of kind of eroticism, where Ruth lies down near Boaz in the threshing floor. He is asleep. She uncovers his feet, which may be significant, symbolic. It may just be uncovering his feet to wake him up. And it's sort of this nocturnal invitation to redeem. And it is all quite chaste, especially if we are comparing it to the previous stories. Okay, I hope we're there. If you want to take a pause and sort of go back over this table and digest it, feel free to do that. I am moving on to the next table. Okay, same rows, different columns. Okay, so now let's take acknowledgement of the fact that that actually in the first two stories, there's a certain tit for tat or revenge or a comeuppance that's actually happening. So for instance, Lot indeed is raped by his daughters, which sounds horrific on just on almost every level. But in fact, let's remember back to the beginning of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, when the angels came to Sodom to visit Lot, and he invited them in, and the townspeople came and asked to bring out his guests so they could have their way with them. He offers his daughters up instead of the guests, which is perhaps an act of hospitality towards the guest, but it is a twisted act, and it's almost a parody of an act of hospitality. And so he is raped by his daughters, whom he had been willing to allow to be raped. Okay, so that is certainly a what we call in Hebrew midah keneged midah, right? That it's like I said, a tit for tat kind of thing in the story itself. Now Judah and Tamar, right? Judah being deceived and taken in this way could be a reference back to, as I mentioned before, the sale of Joseph. He allowed his brother to be sold into slavery. Okay, it's better he wasn't murdered by them, but he was just gotten rid of. And there is a key connection between Tamar's reproval of Judah and reproof of Judah and what happens between between Judah and Joseph, and essentially also Jacob, because the phrase, and this is a key phrase in both stories, is hakerna, right? Lahakir is to recognize, right? It said, look at this, recognize this. That is what the brothers say to Jacob about when they bring him back Joseph's bloodied tunic, and they say, do you recognize this? And he said, oh, that's Joseph's, and he of course assumes that he had been killed by wild beasts, and he goes into intense mourning and stuff. And when Tamar confronts Judah, she takes out the staff and the seal and the cord, and she says the exact same words and said, recognize this, acknowledge this. And so he does. He acknowledges his guilt, and there's so it's in some way some sort of comeuppance or response that he cared deeply for his sons actually, but not nearly as much for his brother. Now, what's amazing is that a central component to the Ruth and Boaz story is that there is no punishment involved in terms of the action itself and the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. Boaz is not being called to account for anything. And in essence, if we want to place it in this column, you have to say, well, it's not at all backward looking in terms of trying to get even because of something that already happened. But this is very forward looking, that all the acts of chesed, all the acts of loving kindness, of grace, of altruism, of generosity that happen in the book, of Ruth to Naomi, and then Naomi to Ruth, and then Boaz to Ruth, and then Ruth to Boaz. All these actions are actually looking forward to a world of chesed, to a world of grace and loving kindness. okay? So that's the first column. The second one is, let's look a little bit more deeply at this idea of the deception that takes place. There are definitely tropes of revealing and concealing of what happens in a very private place, of what then happens in a public place, who knows what, when, etc. And of course, if we mentioned how it is the women who are completely the initiators and the ones who drive the stories forward and take responsibility for themselves and for history, let's look now at the male acts. How did they respond in each of these situations? So as we mentioned, the first story is a story of incest in a dark cave. Won't go Freudian on you here, but a very, very private, very, very enclosed space. And the male is completely passive. As we said, he didn't even know it was happening. Okay. And in the second story, okay, there's the concealment. Tamar conceals herself. She covered her face, but at a place, petach einaim, as I mentioned, the entrance to the eyes, that seems to imply being seen, or at the entrance of being seen, the possibility of being seen. And then what happens in public, all that is private. Nobody knows that's really going on. In fact, Judah doesn't even learn what really had happened until she says, recognize these. Well, first he says, bring her out, right? Bring her out into public, bring her out into the public gaze, the public eye. And then she turns the tables on him and says, well, you're the one that we're looking at because you're the one who is responsible for this. So that, and in this case, as opposed to the Lot, who was completely passive, here Judah ends up responding to Tamar's claim. So he takes responsibility, to his great credit, and he acts, right? But he doesn't really initiate, okay? He responds to everything being brought to him. Whereas in the final story, again, private place, the threshing floor, she uncovers his feet as opposed to Tamar, who covered her face. She uncovers the feet and it's at night, but then the entire rest of the story is acted out completely in the public eye at the gates of the city, completely open and above board, according to custom, according to the consensus of the elders and the people. And that's a big part of chapter 4, of everybody approving of what's going on. And here, of course, once Ruth alerts him, and of course her initiative is completely key in all the different ways that she takes her initiative, but once she alerts him to his responsibility, he completely takes responsibility and initiates the entire rest of the public part of the story. Okay, so that is Boaz. Okay, so now we've already mentioned a lot of these different things, but let's just focus a little bit on the tone and feel of the story. That cave, how can you the cave, not only the cave, but the smell of the fire and brimstone, right? We probably don't, if I say brimstone, you probably don't have a mental image, but brimstone is sulfur, burning sulfur. So raw, like horrible, primitive, raw, savage, Paleolithic, right? We're in the cave, okay? That Paleolithic incestuous event. Second one, moving up from the Paleolithic era to nomadic pastoralism. We're talking about the sheep shearing. And there is a ruse, as we said, but it's also exposed. The whole story is much less raw and savage and much more civilized. But all that is really just another step on the way to the ultimate refinement of this story, where it takes place in full Neolithic agricultural atmosphere of the threshing floor after the harvesting of the crop. It's settled, it's agricultural, and the entire mood, tone, and feel of the story is very refined and very restrained. There's no seduction and getting intoxication, and no incest, and no prostitutes. It's really just kind of bringing things to this beautiful resolution. Okay, and just to put a fine point on that, right? The nature of the relationship between the actors in the story, the very first one was completely the very unsentimental exploitation of the act of reproduction, and it's for the sake of survival. That's all they said. There might not be any other people on the face of the planet. We might be responsible for the continuation of the human race, which is, in fact, if that's really the case, a very noble sentiment. But even so, as we saw, it's the goal there is survival. Here, right, it isn't unsentimental, because we have Judah, who has had his lust excited by this veiled prostitute, right? So she exploits that lust, his lust, but to do her duty and essentially to get not only to do her duty to something else, but to actually get her what she deserves, to get her deserts, which is to say a stable household, a future generation, children, etc. So it's not the survival of the human race, but it's also the continuation of the line. And it's really seeking justice, right? She had been unjustly treated by what had gone on, and so this is her way of achieving justice. And then the third one, Ruth and Boaz, of course, we're talking about mutual responsibility. We're talking about the development of caring, an ethic of caring, of love, of the search for security and happiness, and all this in such a perfect context that it really hints at redemption. And that, of course, is really the focal point of the story, which we'll see now as we draw this to a conclusion. Right, if I'm looking at how does the entire text, right, the tradition itself, both the biblical context as well as later Jewish tradition, how do we look at this story? Are we judging? In what ways are we judging or evaluating the actions of the actors? So originally, Moab and Ammon were not considered friendly neighbors, and we're not. In fact, it said that a Moabite shouldn't enter into the community of Israel, and many people say that this, more academic researchers say that that this story is actually kind of the story of Ruth and Boaz is a backstory. It's this like invention of this great tale to basically justify King David's antecedents, right? If he was indeed the descendant of this line that stretches back to Boaz and Ruth was a Moabite, well, that's a potential problem. So they had to make it kosher somehow. But the original judgment was that that was not a very kosher relationship there, as we've already seen. Now, in the second story, Tamar plays a prostitute, which isn't a very positive connotation. But of course, she is more in the right than I. Right? We have the hero of the story, Judah, saying that she is also a hero, that she is correct, that she has done no wrong, that she has done only what is necessary. And of course, she is blessed with the twin sons of Peretz and Zerach, who and if you don't know the name Peretz, then you might, if you know the hymn of Lecha Dodi, the word Partzi is mentioned, right? The descendant of Peretz, and that's referring to the messianic line, and that of course comes to us from the story of Ruth, right? To conclude it all here, right? Ruth becomes the mother of majesty, which is to say, she is the great grandmother of King David, because Ruth and Boaz gave birth to Obed, who was the father of Jesse, Ishai, who was the father of David. And that's how the story ends. The entire story of the book of Ruth, which again is this just, if you don't know, if you haven't read it recently, and you've heard this entire presentation, without having stopped to read it, stop now or stop when I'm finished, and go back and read the entire story from start to finish, because it's just an amazing story. And it ends, the climax of that story is really at the very end, where we see that the fruit, the issue of that union of Ruth and Boaz is none less than King David. And of course, in Jewish tradition, David becomes the ancestor of the Messiah, Mashiach ben David, the Davidic Messiah. And so Ruth then becomes the progenitor. Ruth is Moabite. Ruth, this descendant of this incestuous union, becomes the mother of Messiah. And so this entire story represents not only the potential redemption of all human history eventually in the Messianic age, but it's also a kind of redemption of those previous stories. It's taking those stories, which if we just read them in their separate context, without the conversation, without the intertextuality going on here, then we might just leave them as something potentially problematic or shocking or incomplete. But here we see them all coming together, forming this complete whole, which is another way of looking at redemption. So thank you very much.